A man can measure his wealth in acres, in cattle, in the gold coins tucked away in a safe. But a man's character? That's measured in the choices he makes when a storm is bearing down on his front door. Cassie Rose was that storm. She arrived at the gates of Thorn Hollow Ranch with nothing to her name but the dust on her clothes and a hunger so deep in her eyes it looked like it might swallow the world. She looked up at the man who owned it all, Garrett Thorne, a man carved from the very rock and timber of the West, and she asked him a simple question. "Any work for a meal, mister?" He was a man who understood boundaries. His land had fences for a reason. He was ready to say no, to send her on her way like he'd done 100 times before. Drifters brought trouble. It was a law of nature. But then he saw her hands. They weren't the soft hands of a woman who'd lost her way. They were weathered, calloused, scarred. They were the hands of a worker. They told a story of hardship, of struggle, but also of a refusal to break. Something shifted in Garrett's chest. A lock he didn't even know was there began to turn. "One day," he said, his voice rougher than he intended, "we'll see how you handle a pitchfork." One day. That was the deal. But one day turned into two. 2 days turned into a week. And the longer Cassie stayed, the more the ghosts of her past began to crawl out of the shadows. There was a dangerous man hunting her, a man who claimed he owned her, and a bounty on her head that made her worth more dead than alive. Soon, Garrett Thorne would have to choose. His safe, quiet life, or the woman who walked in with nothing and somehow, in a matter of days, changed everything. Would a man really risk it all for a stranger who came with nothing but courage? Before we dive into this story of grit, guts, and secrets that can kill, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how far our stories travel, and if this one grabs you, make sure you're subscribed, because what's coming next, you won't want to miss. The dust kicked up by Garrett's boots settled on Cassie's own worn-out leather. She followed him through the main gate of Thorn Hollow, her eyes taking in a world she thought had disappeared forever. Barns the color of dried blood stood against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. A 2-story ranch house with a wide porch sat like a king on its throne, solid and unmovable. This place was built by people who didn't run from a storm. They planted their feet and dared it to do its worst. Garrett walked with a long, easy stride, the walk of a man who knew every inch of his 3,000 acres. His Stetson was tilted just so, shading eyes that had seen more sunrises than most folks had seen days. He was in his early 40s, but the lines around his eyes spoke of a much older soul, one burdened by responsibility. "Stables are this way," he grunted, his voice sounding like he spent more time talking to his horses than to people. "You'll start by mucking out the stalls, sun up to sundown, $1 an hour and 3 meals a day." Cassie clutched her battered leather satchel, a bag that had seen more miles than a stagecoach horse. The buckles were tarnished, the leather scarred, but she held it like a mother holds a newborn child. She was protecting what was inside. Or maybe she was protecting herself from what was inside. "That's more than fair, sir," she said. Her voice was soft, with a hint of a Texas drawl, but it was edged with a weariness that went bone deep. "I'm grateful." The stable was a cathedral of horseflesh and hay. 20 stalls, clean as a church pew, lined the airy space. The air smelled of sweet hay, leather, and the honest sweat of well-cared-for animals. It was the smell of home, a home Cassie hadn't had in a long, long time. "These are my pride," Garrett said, his hand sweeping across the row of magnificent quarter horses. "Every one of them knows their job. They expect the same from the folks who work with them." A massive black stallion, all muscle and midnight, came to the front of his stall, his ears pricked forward, his dark eyes intelligent and curious. Cassie didn't hesitate. She held out her hand, palm up, the way her father had taught her. An offering of peace. The stallion, Thunder he was called, flared his nostrils. He took a moment, judging her, reading her scent, reading her soul. Then He dipped his head and allowed her to stroke the soft spot on his muzzle. Garrett watched, his expression unreadable. "That's Thunder," he said, his voice quiet. "He's particular. My last stable hand worked here for 3 months. Thunder never let him get that close." "He's magnificent," Cassie whispered, her voice full of a reverence she hadn't felt in what felt like a lifetime. "You can see the spirit in his eyes, the fight." Garrett's gaze sharpened. Most folks would say a horse was pretty and move on. This woman, she saw the animal's soul. She understood the language of horses, a language that couldn't be learned from a book. It had to be lived. "You've worked with horses before," he stated. It wasn't a question. "Some," she said, her hand never leaving Thunder's neck. "My father had a small place, nothing like this, but he taught me that horses remember kindness, and they remember cruelty even longer." A shadow passed over her face when she mentioned her father. It was quick, a flicker of pain, but Garrett saw it. Everyone who washed up on his shores had a story. Most were simple tales of bad luck. Hers felt different. It felt like a story that was still being written, and the ink was blood. He pulled a gold pocket watch from his vest. It was worn smooth from the hands of his father and his grandfather before him. It was a piece of his history, a reminder of the legacy he was trying to uphold. "It's 7 o'clock. Breakfast is at 8 in the main house. Maria runs the kitchen. Stay on her good side." The kitchen glowed with a warm, welcoming light. Through the window, Cassie could see copper pots hanging from the ceiling and a large wooden table that had seen decades of meals. It was a scene of such perfect domesticity that it made her chest ache with a longing she couldn't afford to feel. Maria Santos, a woman in her 50s with eyes that missed nothing, looked Cassie up and down. Her gaze was sharp, assessing. She'd seen 100 drifters come and go. "¿Quién es esta?" she asked Garrett. "Who is this one?" "New hand," Garrett replied in fluent Spanish. Cassie rose. "She'll be in the stables." Maria's expression softened just a fraction as she took in Cassie's worn clothes and the quiet dignity in her posture. This wasn't some grifter looking for an easy mark. This was someone who understood that a day's work was a privilege. "Bienvenida," she said, then switched to English. "You look hungry, mija. Sit. I'll make you a real breakfast." The unexpected kindness was like a physical blow. Cassie had to blink back tears as she sat at the table. She felt fragile, like a piece of glass that had been chipped and was just one wrong move away from shattering completely. "Just coffee is fine, ma'am," Cassie said, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't want to be a bother." Maria scoffed, pulling a heavy iron skillet from a hook. "Nonsense. Trouble is letting a good woman work on an empty stomach. You eat, you work. Simple." Soon the kitchen was filled with the sizzle of bacon and the smell of fresh coffee. It was the smell of safety, the smell of normal. And for Cassie, normal was the most dangerous thing in the world. It was a temptation. It was a weakness she couldn't afford. Garrett sat across from her, his presence a solid, calming weight. In the bright kitchen light, he could see the story etched on her face. Her clothes were worn thin, but they were clean, mended with neat, careful stitches. Her hair, though dusty, was carefully braided. And her hands, those hands told him everything he needed to know. They were the hands of someone who knew how to build, how to mend, how to hold on. "When was the last time you ate?" he asked, his voice low. "Yesterday," she lied. Then, correcting herself, she said, "The day before, I think. I'm fine. I've gone longer." She said it so casually, as if starvation were just another kind of weather, and that more than anything, stirred something fierce and protective in Garrett's chest. He'd seen desperate people before, but this woman was different. She wasn't broken. She was just bent. Maria placed a heaping plate in front of Cassie. Eggs, thick-cut bacon, hash browns, and 2 steaming biscuits. It was more food than Cassie had seen in a week. Her eyes widened, and for a terrifying second, she thought she was going to cry. I can't eat all this," she stammered. "You can and you will," Maria said, her tone leaving no room for argument. A body needs fuel to do real work. Eat. The first bite of food was like a dam breaking. She ate quickly, efficiently, not because she was starving, but because she'd learned never to take a meal for granted. She'd learned that every bite could be her last. Between mouthfuls, she looked around the kitchen. There were photos on the windowsill, generations of thorns on this very ranch. There were herbs growing in little pots. This wasn't just a house, it was a home, a place where roots grew deep. "It's a beautiful place," she said, her voice soft. "You've built something special here." Garrett followed her gaze. "My grandfather started it. My father built it up. I'm just trying my best not to be the one who loses it." His humility was surprising. A man with this much land, this much wealth, usually took all the credit. But Garrett spoke of himself as a caretaker, a temporary guardian of a legacy. "That's a rare thing," Cassie said quietly, "to understand that we're just passing through." The comment hung in the air between them. It was a piece of philosophy you wouldn't expect from a hungry drifter. Garrett looked at her, really looked at her, and saw an intelligence and a depth that didn't match her circumstances. Who was this woman? "What brings you to this part of Colorado?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. Her fork paused. A shutter came down behind her eyes. A mask slipped into place. "Just traveling, looking for work." It wasn't the whole truth. Garrett knew it. He was a man who could read a horse's moods from 50 yards away. Reading a person was just a matter of paying attention, and he was paying very close attention to Cassie Rose. "Well," he said, letting it drop for now, "you found work here, for as long as you need it." He meant it as a simple offer of employment, but the words landed with a different weight. They sounded like a promise. They sounded like sanctuary. And for Cassie, who had been running from hell itself, the offer of sanctuary was the most dangerous temptation of all, because sanctuaries could become traps, and promises could be broken. Just outside the kitchen, 2 more ranch hands entered. One was an older man, Jake Morrison, the foreman, with a face like a leather map of the West. The other was a younger man, Tommy Santos, Maria's son, shy and quick-eyed. "Heard we got new help," Jake said, nodding at Cassie. "Cassie Rose," Garrett introduced. "She'll be in the stables, knows her way around horses." "Good," Jake said, grabbing a mug of coffee. "Lord knows we need it. Spring roundup's coming." The talk turned to ranch business, fences that needed mending, a sickness in the North herd, the price of beef in Denver. Cassie listened, absorbing the rhythms of this place. It was a well-oiled machine, built on trust and hard work. She felt a pull, a dangerous desire to be a part of it, to belong. But belonging was a luxury she couldn't afford, because the man who was hunting her didn't just want to find her, he wanted to own her, and he was closer than any of them could possibly imagine. 3 days. For 3 blissful, terrifying days, Cassie allowed herself to sink into the rhythm of Thorn Hollow. The work was hard, the sun was hot, but it was honest. It was real. The horses, especially Thunder, had come to accept her. He would nicker softly when she approached, a low rumble of greeting that soothed a part of her soul she thought had died. She was mucking out his stall on the 4th morning, lost in the simple, repetitive motion, when it happened. She reached into her worn leather satchel for a piece of twine, and her fingers brushed against it. The photograph. It slipped from her grasp, fluttering to the hay-strewn floor like a fallen leaf. Her heart stopped dead in her chest. She snatched it up, but not before the image burned itself into her mind again. A younger Cassie, smiling, squinting in the sun. Beside her, a man with kind eyes and a proud grin, her father. They were standing in front of their small, humble farmhouse, a place that was once her whole world, but that wasn't the part that made her blood run cold. At the edge of the frame, there was a third figure. A man. His face, however, was gone. It had been violently scratched out, obliterated with the tip of a knife, leaving nothing but a jagged, angry scar on the paper. A black hole where a monster used to be. Cassie? She spun around, her body rigid, her hand crushing the photograph in her fist. Garrett stood in the stable doorway, a friendly smile on his face that vanished the moment he saw her. He saw the stark terror in her eyes. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "Fine," she choked out, stuffing the crumpled photo back into her satchel. "Just dropped something." It was a terrible lie. Her hands were shaking. Her breathing was ragged. She looked like a spooked mare, ready to bolt at the slightest sound. Garrett had seen that look before, in animals that had been abused. He took a slow step into the stable, keeping his distance. "You sure? You look like you've just seen a ghost." His kindness was her undoing. For 3 days, she had been lulled into a false sense of security by the simple decency of this place. She had let her guard down, and now the past had come crashing back in. "I'm fine," she repeated, but her voice broke. Garrett's eyes narrowed. He didn't know what was in that photo, but he knew it was the source of the fear that clung to her like a shroud. "Cassie," he said, his voice low and steady, the voice he used to calm a frightened horse. "I don't know what's got you so scared, but you're safe here." Safe. The word was a foreign language. When was the last time she'd felt safe? "You don't understand," she whispered, clutching the satchel to her chest like a shield. "I can't stay here. I've already stayed too long. I have to keep moving." "Moving from what?" Garrett pressed, his patience wearing thin. This wasn't just a case of bad luck. This was something darker. From who? The walls she had so carefully built around her heart began to crumble. The secret she had carried for months, a poison she'd been swallowing every single day, rose up in her throat. "There's a man," she said, the words spilling out in a desperate rush. "His name is Dutch Kellerman." Garrett felt a chill crawl up his spine. The name was familiar, though he couldn't place it. A name whispered in saloons, associated with trouble. "He claims I owe him a debt," Cassie continued, her voice trembling. "A debt my father supposedly left behind. He says that makes me his property." The air in the stable grew thick and heavy. Garrett's face hardened, the friendly rancher disappearing, replaced by something older, something more dangerous. The man who had inherited the grit of his grandfather. "What kind of debt?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Gambling debts," she spat, a spark of anger cutting through her fear. "Lies. My father never gambled a day in his life. He was a good man, an honest man. Dutch was his foreman. Before..." Her voice trailed off. "Before what, Cassie?" Garrett prodded gently. "Before he died," she whispered. The words were flat. Dead. There was an accident. On the ranch, a piece of machinery. She looked up at Garrett, her eyes pleading with him to believe her. "But it wasn't an accident. My father was a careful man. He knew that machine inside and out. Dutch did something to it." The ugly picture was becoming clearer. A predatory foreman, a suspicious death, a manufactured debt. "And after your father died," Garrett said, connecting the dots, "Dutch came to collect." Cassie nodded, her face pale. "He said I could work off the debt. He made it very clear what kind of work he had in mind." The implication was horrifying. A vision of a life that was a prison, a life of forced servitude to a monster. "So you ran?" "I ran," she confirmed, her body slumping against the stall. The fight seemed to drain out of her. "For 4 months I've been running. I thought I lost him in Kansas, but then I started hearing things. A man asking questions in the towns I'd just left. A man matching his description." A dreadful realization dawned on Garrett. "Tommy," he said. "When he went to town for supplies yesterday." Cassie's eyes filled with a fresh wave of terror. "He mentioned it. A man asking about a woman traveling alone. He thought it was strange. I knew it was Dutch. I was going to leave this morning. I swear I was. I wasn't going to bring this trouble to your door." Her selflessness, her concern for them even in the midst of her own terror, was astounding. She had been through hell. Yet her first thought was to protect the people who had shown her a sliver of kindness. "This is my ranch," Garrett said, his voice a low growl. "My door. I decide who and what comes through it. You're not running anymore, Cassie." "You don't know him!" she cried. "He's not just one man. He has people who work for him. Men who do whatever he says, no questions asked. They're animals." "I don't care what he is," Garrett interrupted, stepping closer. His eyes bored into hers, fierce and protective. "I know what you are. You're a hard worker. You're kind to my horses. You're a good person who's been dealt a bad hand. And no man, I don't care who he is, has the right to treat another human being like property." She stared at him, speechless. She saw in his eyes the same stubborn, unyielding honor that had been in her father's, the kind of honor that got a man killed. "Why?" she whispered, the question torn from the deepest part of her. "Why would you do this? You barely know me." Garrett looked away for a moment, toward the open plains that stretched out beyond the stable doors, the land his family had fought and bled for. "My father taught me that you don't measure a man by how he acts when things are easy. You measure him by what he does when things are hard, when someone is in need." He looked back at her, his gaze unwavering. "And right now, Cassie, it looks to me like you're in need." "This is the right thing to do," he said simply. "And I'll be damned if I'm going to let some bully chase a good woman off my land." The simple, powerful decency of his words broke the dam inside her. The tears she had held back for 4 long months finally came, hot and furious. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to tear her apart. Garrett stood his ground, a silent guardian, giving her the space she needed to let the poison out. He didn't touch her, didn't offer empty platitudes. He just stood there, a solid, unmovable presence, a wall between her and the storm. When the tears finally subsided, she wiped her face, looking exhausted but somehow lighter. "He won't just go away," she said, her voice raspy. "Then we'll be ready for him," Garrett replied, his tone shifting. The rancher was gone. The strategist had taken over. "First thing, I'm riding into town to talk to Sheriff Harrison. This is Colorado, not some lawless patch of Texas. We have laws here." "And what if the law isn't enough?" she asked, the fear still lingering. "What if Dutch has money, influence?" A grim smile touched Garrett's lips. "Then we handle it ourselves," he said. The statement was not a boast. It was a fact. "This ranch is full of good people who know the difference between right and wrong. Dutch Kellerman is about to find out that Thorn Hollow doesn't bend, and it sure as hell doesn't break." For the first time in months, a tiny, fragile flicker of hope ignited in Cassie's chest. It was a dangerous feeling. Hope could be a trap. But as she looked at Garrett Thorne, she saw a man who didn't make promises he couldn't keep. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You don't have to thank me," he replied, his voice softening again. "You just have to trust me. Can you do that?" She looked into his steady, honest eyes. In a world of lies and monsters, he was a beacon of truth. "Yes," she said, and the word felt like an anchor. "I can trust you." The scratched-out photograph in her satchel suddenly felt less like a curse and more like a challenge. The battle wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. But for the first time, Cassie Rose didn't feel like she was fighting it alone. And that made all the difference. The hand-carved wooden cross was smooth and warm in Cassie's palm. Her father had made it for her from a piece of scrap pine when she was just a girl, scared of a thunderstorm. "Faith isn't about knowing for sure, Cassie girl," he'd told her. "It's about holding on tight when the world is shaking." She'd held on to it ever since, through every hardship, every loss. For the past 4 months, it had been the only thing that felt real. Now, sitting on the edge of the narrow cot in the small room above the stables, she felt the world shaking again. The sun was setting, painting the sky in angry shades of orange and red. It looked like the sky was bleeding. A knock on her door made her jump. Her hand instinctively tightened around the cross. "Cassie," It's Garrett." She opened the door to find him standing there, his hat in his hands, his face etched with a gravity she hadn't seen before. The easygoing rancher was gone, replaced by a man preparing for war. "He was here," Garrett said, wasting no time. "Kellerman came by this morning asking questions. Jake sent him packing." The breath left Cassie's lungs in a painful rush. He was here. The monster was no longer a distant shadow. He was at the gates. "I have to go," she said, turning to grab her satchel. "I have to leave now before he comes back." "No." The word was sharp, absolute. Garrett stepped into the room, blocking her path. "The time for running is over. This ends here, one way or another." "You don't know what he's capable of," she pleaded. "He's a killer." "Then help me understand," Garrett said, his voice softening. "Tell me everything. Tell me about your father." She hesitated. The story was a wound, and speaking it was like tearing it open again. But she looked at Garrett, at the stubborn resolve in his eyes, and knew he wouldn't back down. He deserved the truth, all of it. So she told him. She told him about her father, Thomas Rose, an honest man who could make grass grow on rock. She told him how her father had taken a barren section of Kellerman's ranch and turned it into the most productive grazing land in the county. "Dutch couldn't stand it," she said, her voice thick with old anger. "He couldn't believe an honest man could be that successful. He thought my father was cheating him, stealing cattle, skimming profits. He was obsessed." The story tumbled out, a torrent of injustice and grief. Kellerman had demanded her father sign over a share of the land. When he refused, Kellerman had fabricated the gambling debts, producing forged IOUs and paying other ranch hands to lie for him. "My father wouldn't back down," she said, a sad pride in her voice. "He wasn't afraid of Dutch. He was going to expose him." "And that's when the accident happened," Garrett finished for her, his face a grim mask. Cassie's composure finally broke. Tears streamed down her face. "The hay baler. Dutch claimed the safety catch failed, but I saw it, Garrett. I saw the marks on the metal where he filed it down. He rigged it. He murdered my father and called it an accident." The pure evil of it settled in the small room, cold and suffocating. "The sheriff in Amarillo wouldn't listen. The judge was a friend of Dutch's. They all told me to honor the debt. They told me I belonged to him." She shuddered. "So I ran, and he sent men after me, bounty hunters." She sank onto the cot, the weight of her story crushing her. "I'm so tired of running, Garrett," she whispered. He moved to sit beside her, his presence a solid comfort in the growing darkness. "You don't have to run anymore, Cassie. You have to fight." "How? He has money, men, influence. And we have the truth," Garrett said fiercely. "And we have this ranch, and the good people on it." He looked her in the eye. "My father always said that evil only wins when good men do nothing. I'm not going to do nothing, Cassie. Not now. Not ever." His conviction was a fire in the darkness. It was a promise of a dawn she had thought would never come. "Why?" she asked again, needing to understand. "Why risk all this for me?" Garrett was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "Because when I look at you, I see someone who has been through the fire and hasn't been burned. I see strength. I see courage. And because you matter, Cassie." His words, simple and direct, struck her with the force of a physical blow. You matter. It had been so long since anyone had seen her as anything more than a problem, a piece of property, a target. Before she could respond, a sound drifted up from the ranch yard below. The thunder of approaching horses, fast, purposeful. They both froze, their eyes meeting in a shared, sudden dread. "Stay here," Garrett commanded, moving to the window. "No," Cassie said, getting to her feet, her fear replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "We face him together. No more running." They looked down into the yard. 3 riders. In the center, a large, broad-shouldered man whose arrogance was visible even in the dim light. Dutch Kellerman. And on either side of him, 2 men who looked like they were carved from malice, Jake Morrison, the foreman, was standing in the yard, blocking their path, his hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. "He's getting angry," Cassie whispered, recognizing the telltale signs in Dutch's posture. The way his shoulders were bunched, his hands clenching and unclenching on the reins. "Good," Garrett said, his voice a low growl. "Angry men make mistakes." The confrontation below was short and tense. They couldn't hear the words, but they could see the aggression. They saw Dutch lean forward in his saddle, spitting words at Jake. They saw Jake stand his ground, unmovable as an old oak tree. Finally, with a furious gesture, Dutch wheeled his horse around. He and his men galloped out of the yard, disappearing into the night. But they all knew it wasn't over. It was a retreat, not a surrender. A few minutes later, Jake knocked on the door. His face was grim. He demanded to search the place, claimed he had a legal right to his property. I told him to come back with the sheriff and a warrant. "How'd he take it?" Garrett asked. "Made some threats. Said we'd all regret interfering. Said he'd be back." Jake looked at Cassie, his eyes full of a surprising gentleness. "Don't you worry, miss. We've dealt with bullies before." His simple, unquestioning loyalty brought a lump to Cassie's throat. "I've got the hands posted on watch," Jake continued, "and I sent Tommy to ride for Sheriff Harrison. He should be here by morning." After Jake left, a heavy silence settled in the room. The threat was no longer abstract. It had a face, it had a name, and it had promised to return. "My father used to say," Cassie said softly, her hand finding the cross beneath her shirt, "that running from a fight just means you'll be weaker when you finally have to face it." "He sounds like a wise man," Garrett said. "He was," she said. "He also said that some fights are about more than just you. They're about everyone who comes after." The weight of that settled on Garrett's shoulders. This wasn't just about protecting Cassie anymore. It was about making a stand. It was about drawing a line in the dust and telling the monsters of the world, this far and no further. "Tomorrow," Garrett said, his voice resonating with grim certainty, "everything changes." "Yes," Cassie agreed, her own voice steady and strong. "Tomorrow, we stop running, and we start fighting back." Down in the stables, Thunder, the black stallion, stamped a hoof and let out a low whinny, as if he could sense the shift in the air. The peace of Thorn Hollow had been shattered. The ranch was no longer a sanctuary, it was a fortress, and the siege was about to begin. The engagement ring was a ghost. It lay in the bottom drawer of Garrett's desk, tucked inside a velvet box the color of a faded bruise. He hadn't looked at it in 3 years, not since Sarah Manning, the banker's daughter from Denver, had given it back to him. "You don't love me, Garrett," she'd said, her voice gentle but firm. "And I don't love you. We love the idea of each other, and that's not enough." She'd been right. He had admired Sarah. He had respected her. But love? The all-consuming, world-altering, risk-everything kind of love? No, he hadn't known what that was. Until now. As the sun began to hint at its arrival, painting the eastern sky in pale shades of gray, Garrett found himself thinking of Cassie. The feeling he had for her was nothing like the calm affection he'd felt for Sarah. This was a wildfire. It was a lightning storm. It was dangerous and unpredictable, and it made him feel more alive than he had in his entire life. A knock on his office door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Maria, carrying a tray with coffee and biscuits. Her face was etched with worry. "The sheriff is here," she announced. "He's with Jake in the kitchen. He arrived before dawn." She looked at Garrett, her dark eyes seeing more than he wanted them to. "That girl, Cassie. She has steel in her spine. But she is afraid. Do not let your own fear make you do something foolish, patron." Her words hit him with uncomfortable accuracy. He was afraid. Afraid of what Dutch Kellerman would do. Afraid of what it would cost to stop him. And most of all, afraid of what he was feeling for Cassie, a woman who was tangled up in a world of trouble. He found Sheriff Bob Harrison in the kitchen. He was a big man, with a weathered face and a quiet authority that inspired confidence. He was listening intently as Cassie, in a clear, steady voice, told him her story. She left nothing out: the murder of her father, the forged debts, the months of running, the terror. When she was finished, Harrison was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on her face. "This Kellerman," he said finally. "If he had a legitimate legal claim, he would have come with a marshal and a proper court order, not with threats and hired guns." "So what are our options, Sheriff?" Garrett asked. "For now, Miss Rose is under the protection of the law in this county. If Kellerman shows his face again, I have grounds to arrest him for trespassing and intimidation." As if on cue, Tommy Santos, Maria's son, burst into the kitchen. His face was pale, his eyes wide. He was holding a piece of paper. "Found this nailed to the main gate," he said, his voice trembling. Garrett took the paper. The words were scrawled in a crude, angry hand. "The woman is mine. You have until sunset tomorrow to turn her over. Interfere, and I will burn your ranch to the ground and salt the earth." Sheriff Harrison read the note over Garrett's shoulder. A grim smile touched his lips. "Well," he said, "that just made my job a whole lot easier. That's not a legal claim. That's a terrorist threat." "Do you think he'll really do it?" Cassie asked, her voice a whisper. "A man like that?" Harrison said, his eyes hard. "He's a rabid dog, Miss Rose, and there's only one way to deal with a rabid dog. I'm going to ride back to town and send for a federal marshal, but it will take a day, maybe 2, for them to get here." He looked at Garrett. "Until then, Mr. Thorne, I suggest you and your men stay vigilant." After the sheriff left, a heavy, tense silence fell over the ranch. The threat was no longer a matter of if, but when. Sunset tomorrow. They were on a clock. Garrett found Cassie in the stables, grooming Thunder. Her hands were steady, her movements calm, but he could see the tension in the set of her jaw. "He said he'd burn it down," she said, her voice hollow. "All of this. Because of me." "This isn't because of you, Cassie," Garrett said, his voice fierce. "This is because of him, because of his greed and his cruelty. You're just the one who was brave enough to stand up to him." He watched her with the horses. There was a magic in her hands, a gentleness in her spirit that the animals understood. She had a gift for calming frightened things. He wondered if she could calm the storm that was raging inside of him. He was falling in love with her. The realization was as terrifying as it was undeniable. Loving her meant embracing the danger she brought with her. It meant putting his home, his legacy, his very life on the line. His mind went back to the ring in his desk drawer. The safe choice, the sensible choice. Sarah would never have brought a firestorm like this to his door. But Sarah would never have inspired him to fight one either. That evening, as the men took up armed positions around the ranch, Garrett made a decision. He walked back to his office, opened the bottom drawer of his desk, and took out the velvet box. He didn't open it. He just held it in his hand for a long moment. Then he walked out to the porch where Cassie was sitting, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in the colors of a fresh bruise. He didn't say a word. He just opened his hand and showed her the box. She looked at it, then up at him, her eyes wide with a question she didn't dare ask. "It was for someone else," he said, his voice quiet but clear in the twilight. "A long time ago. It was a mistake. I didn't know what love was. I think I'm starting to learn." He didn't offer her the ring. It wasn't the time. It wasn't the place. But it was a promise. A promise of a future, if they could just survive the next 24 hours. A single tear traced a path through the dust on Cassie's cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness or of fear. It was a tear of hope, a dangerous, beautiful, terrifying thing. "Garrett," she whispered. But whatever she was going to say was lost in a sudden new sound. The sound of a single gunshot, echoing in the distance. It was followed by another, and another. They weren't coming from the direction of the main gate. They were coming from the back of the ranch, from the north pasture. Jake Morrison came running from the barn, his rifle in his hand. "They're not waiting for sunset," he yelled. "They're already here." The siege of Thorn Hollow had begun. The bent and tarnished sheriff's badge lay on Harrison's desk. It didn't belong to him. It had belonged to a man named Marcus Cole, a sheriff down in the Texas Panhandle. A good man who had been asking too many questions about Dutch Kellerman, a man who had turned up dead in a hunting accident 2 years ago. "A friend of mine sent it to me," Sheriff Harrison told Garrett and Cassie. They were in his office in town. The battle at the ranch had been a feint, a diversion. Kellerman and a handful of men had drawn their fire at the north fence, while another group had tried to sneak in from the south. Tommy Santos, posted as a lookout, had spotted them, and they'd managed to fight them off. But it had been a close thing. 2 of Garrett's men had been wounded. The attack had proven one thing: Kellerman wasn't going to wait. He was coming. And he was coming to kill. Sheriff Cole was looking into land fraud, Harrison explained, his face grim. A pattern of it. Small ranchers, good men like your father, Cassie, who owned valuable land with water rights, land that suddenly became a lot more valuable. These ranchers kept dying in accidents. And their land, often burdened by mysterious last-minute debts, kept ending up in the hands of one man. "Dutch Kellerman," Garrett said. "No," Harrison said, and the single word dropped like a stone in the quiet room. "Not Kellerman. He was just the muscle. The land ended up in the hands of a corporation owned by a very powerful, very well-connected man." He slid a file across the desk. Garrett opened it. The name on the incorporation papers made his blood run cold. Robert Hayes Mitchell, the territorial commissioner, one of the most powerful men in Colorado. The scope of it was staggering. This wasn't just one monster hunting one woman. This was a conspiracy, a vast criminal enterprise that reached into the highest levels of government. "My father," Cassie whispered, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. "He wasn't just a rancher. His land, the railroad was planning to build a depot there. He found out. He must have. That's why they killed him. His land wasn't just valuable. It was a keystone." "Exactly," Harrison said. "And you, Miss Rose, are not just a loose end. You are the only person alive who can connect Kellerman directly to the murder of your father. That's why he can't let you live." The weight of it was crushing. She wasn't just fighting for her life. She was fighting for justice for her father and for all the other men who had been murdered by this shadowy conspiracy. "But Kellerman is just a pawn," Garrett said, his mind racing. "The real target is Mitchell." "And Mitchell is untouchable," Harrison countered. "He has judges in his pocket. He has politicians who owe him favors. He'll bury us in legal paperwork and false accusations. He'll paint you, Mr. Thorne, as a vigilante harboring a fugitive. He'll paint you, Miss Rose, as a delusional, hysterical woman." It was a perfect, diabolical trap. "But there's more," Harrison said, his voice dropping even lower. He pulled out a leather-bound ledger. "We took this off one of the men we captured last night. It's Kellerman's. It looks like his private accounting book." He opened it. The pages were filled with meticulous entries. Names, dates, payments. It was a record of the entire conspiracy, bribes to judges, payments to hired guns, and chillingly, a list of acquisitions. Her father's name was on it. And beside each payment, a set of initials. RHM Robert Hayes Mitchell. It was the smoking gun, the proof they needed. But it was also a death warrant. "If Mitchell knows we have this," Garrett said, his voice tight, "he won't send a small raiding party. He'll send an army. He'll use his authority as commissioner to deputize every hired gun from here to Denver, and he'll come to wipe us off the map. He'll call it enforcing the law." A cold dread filled the room. They were trapped. If they stayed at the ranch, Mitchell would bring the full force of his corrupt power down on them. If they ran, they would be hunted as fugitives, and the ledger, the only proof of Mitchell's crimes, would be lost. "There's one other thing," Cassie said, her mind catching on a detail from the ledger. She pointed to a page. "Look at this name. Jake Morrison. Garrett stared at the page. His foreman's name, and next to it, a payment, dated 3 days ago, the day Cassie arrived. The air was sucked out of the room. Jake, the steady, loyal foreman who had worked for his father, the man who had been like a second father to him, a spy, a traitor. The betrayal was a physical blow, knocking the wind out of Garrett. He felt a fool. He had trusted Jake completely. And all this time, the enemy had been inside his own gates. He must have been the one who told Kellerman you were there, Harrison said grimly. Garrett's mind reeled. Every conversation, every plan they had made. Jake had heard it all. He knew their defenses. He knew their weaknesses. He knew exactly where to hit them. Suddenly, Garrett understood. The attack on the north fence. It wasn't a feint. It was designed to draw Garrett and his most loyal men to one side of the ranch, while Jake, on the inside, opened the gate for Kellerman on the other. They had to get back to the ranch. Now. They burst out of the sheriff's office and ran for their horses. The ride back to Thorn Hollow was a frantic, desperate race against time. Every shadow seemed to hold an enemy. Every gust of wind sounded like a gunshot. As they crested the last hill overlooking the ranch, Garrett's heart seized in his chest. Smoke. Thick black smoke was billowing up from the direction of the main house. They spurred their horses into a reckless gallop, their hearts pounding with a terrible shared fear. They were too late. When they arrived, the scene was one of utter devastation. The bunkhouse was on fire. Several of Garrett's men lay on the ground, wounded or worse. And in the center of the yard, Dutch Kellerman stood over a kneeling figure, Maria. He had a pistol to her head, and standing beside him, a rifle in his hand, his face a mask of cold betrayal, was Jake Morrison. "Welcome home, boss," Jake said, a cruel sneer twisting his features. "You're just in time for the party." Garrett and Cassie skidded to a halt, their horses rearing. They were surrounded. Kellerman's men were everywhere. "Drop the guns," Kellerman snarled, "or the old woman gets it." Garrett's hand hovered over his pistol. His mind was a whirlwind of rage and despair. He had walked right into the trap. Jake had played him perfectly. "I'm surprised at you, Jake," Garrett said, his voice dangerously calm, buying time, trying to find an angle, an opening. "My father trusted you." "Your father was a fool," Jake spat. "Just like you, Mitchell pays better." The world seemed to slow down. Garrett saw it all in a flash. Cassie, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a defiant fire. Maria kneeling in the dust, her expression one of stony courage. Kellerman, his finger tightening on the trigger. And Jake, the traitor, the man who had destroyed everything. But then Garrett saw something else, something that didn't make sense. He saw Jake's eyes. They weren't cold and cruel. They were filled with a desperate, agonizing pain. And he saw Jake's rifle. It wasn't pointed at Garrett. It was pointed almost imperceptibly at Dutch Kellerman. And in that split second, Garrett understood. The ledger. The payment. It wasn't a bribe. It was blackmail. Mitchell had something on Jake. He was being forced to do this. This wasn't a betrayal. It was a sacrifice. "Now, Garrett," Jake said, his voice thick with a meaning only Garrett could understand, and all hell broke loose. Jake swung his rifle, not at Garrett, but at Kellerman. The shot went wide as Kellerman, reacting with animal speed, shoved Maria to the ground and fired back. The bullet caught Jake square in the chest. Garrett drew his pistol and fired, the sound of the shot deafening. Kellerman grunted and staggered back, clutching a wound in his shoulder. Cassie, reacting with a speed Garrett had never seen, dove for the ground, grabbing a fallen ranch hand's rifle. She came up firing, providing cover for Garrett. The ranch yard exploded into a maelstrom of gunfire and chaos. Jake lay on the ground, a crimson stain spreading across his shirt. He looked at Garrett, a sad, apologetic smile on his lips. "The ledger," he gasped. "Get the ledger." And then his eyes went vacant. Rage, pure and primal, surged through Garrett. He charged forward, firing at Kellerman, who was trying to retreat behind the cover of his men. It was a suicide run, he knew it, but he didn't care. All he could see was Jake's face. All he could feel was the searing pain of betrayal, not by Jake, but by a world that could force a good man to do such a terrible thing. But then, a new sound cut through the chaos, the thunder of hoofbeats, dozens of them. Pouring over the hill came a wave of riders. Sheriff Harrison, leading a posse of deputized townsfolk and ranchers from the neighboring spreads. They had come. Kellerman's men, caught between two fires, broke and ran. The tide of the battle turned in an instant. Kellerman, wounded and alone, made a desperate break for the burning bunkhouse, disappearing into the smoke and flames. Garrett didn't hesitate. He ran in after him. The heat was intense, the smoke thick and choking. He could hear Kellerman coughing and cursing somewhere in the inferno. He found him near the back wall, trying to pry loose a board to escape. Garrett leveled his pistol. "It's over, Kellerman." The big man spun around, his face a mask of hate, a knife appearing in his hand. He lunged. Garrett fired. The fight for Thorn Hollow was over, but the war was just beginning, and it had cost them dearly. The rifle felt heavy in Garrett's hands. It had been his father's. Now it was just a piece of wood and steel, a tool he had used to defend a home that was now mostly ashes. The main house had been saved, but the bunkhouse was gone. The stables were heavily damaged, and Jake Morrison, the man who had been the ranch's heart for 30 years, was buried on the hill overlooking what was left of it all. The ledger had been recovered from Jake's saddlebag. His final act had been to protect it. It was now in the hands of federal marshals, sent from Denver after Sheriff Harrison's frantic telegram. The conspiracy was out in the open. Robert Hayes Mitchell, the powerful territorial commissioner, was now a hunted fugitive. But victory felt like ashes in Garrett's mouth. He sat on the porch steps, the smell of smoke still thick in the air. He felt hollowed out, a building whose foundations had been ripped away. Cassie came and sat beside him. She didn't say anything. She just sat there, her presence a quiet, steady comfort in the midst of his grief. For days the ranch had been crawling with federal agents, investigators, and newspaper reporters. The story of the Thorn Hollow siege, and the vast conspiracy it had uncovered, was the talk of the territory. They were heroes, the papers said. Garrett didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had failed to protect his own. "It wasn't your fault, Garrett," Cassie said softly, as if reading his mind. "Jake made a choice. He chose to save us." "He shouldn't have had to make that choice," Garrett said, his voice rough. "No," she agreed. "He shouldn't have. But he did. And now we have to make it mean something." She was right. He knew she was. Their fight had been for more than just a piece of land. It had been for a principle. It had been for men like his father, and Cassie's father, and for Jake. Good men who had been crushed by the greed of the powerful. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her eyes, the resilience that had seen her through her own personal hell. In the midst of all this loss, all this destruction, she was the one thing that felt solid, the one thing that felt like hope. A rider approached the ranch, a U.S. Marshal. He had news. "We got him," the Marshal said, dismounting. "Mitchell. We tracked him to a mining camp in the mountains. He didn't come quietly." There was a finality in the Marshal's voice that told Garrett everything he needed to know. Mitchell was dead. The head of the snake had been cut off. The Marshal handed Garrett a thick envelope. "This is from the territorial government and the railroad. Reparations." Garrett opened it. It was a bank draft for a staggering amount of money, enough to rebuild the ranch 10 times over. And there was another document, the deed to Cassie's father's land. The railroad, in an effort to distance itself from the scandal, had returned the property to his rightful heir. Cassie was now officially a very wealthy woman. She looked at the deed, her expression unreadable. Then she looked at Garrett. "I don't want it," she said. "Cassie," he started, "that land is your birthright. It's what your father died for." "No," she said, her voice firm. My father died for his principles, not for a piece of dirt. This land is stained with blood. I want to sell it. And do what? He asked. Start a foundation, she said, her eyes shining with a sudden, fierce purpose. In my father's name, and in Jake's. A fund to help people like us, people who are being bullied and cheated by men like Mitchell. We can use the money to provide legal help, to investigate corruption. We can use it to fight back. He stared at her, his heart swelling with an emotion so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. She was magnificent. She had taken her pain, her loss, her grief, and she was forging it into a weapon for good. He finally understood. Home wasn't a place. It wasn't a collection of buildings. It was a person. It was a choice. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the velvet box. This time, he opened it. The ring, a simple gold band with a small, perfect diamond, glinted in the afternoon sun. He got down on one knee, there in the dust and the ashes of his old life. Cassie Rose, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I have lost my home. I have lost one of the best men I've ever known. I feel like I have lost everything. He looked up at her, his eyes locking with hers. But if I have you, I have everything I will ever need. I love you. Will you marry me? Will you help me build a new home, right here on this land? A home built not on legacy, but on love. Tears streamed down Cassie's face, but this time they were not tears of sorrow. She knelt in front of him, taking his face in her hands. Yes, Garrett Thorne, she whispered. Yes, 1,000 times, yes. He slipped the ring on her finger. It was a perfect fit. The fight was over. The war was won. The cost had been immense. But as they knelt there, in the ruins of the past, they were not looking back. They were looking forward, to a future they would build together. A future forged in fire, built on courage, and sealed with a love that had proven it could withstand any storm. Out on the hill, 3 graves stood as silent sentinels: Thomas Rose, Jake Morrison, and Robert Hayes Mitchell. One a victim, one a hero, one a monster. Their stories were finished. But for Garrett and Cassie, their story was just beginning. If this story of courage and redemption moved you, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Because the greatest stories are the ones that remind us that even in the darkest of nights, the dawn is coming. We've got another one for you tomorrow, and trust me, you won't want to miss it.